There have been recent hearings before the Senate Budget Committee and the Senate Banking Committee in Washington on this national problem. Recent articles in the LA Times focused on this issue. There was legislation that did not get out of the California legislature on the topic. It's very much front of mind. The purpose of this meeting is to have an informative discussion of how climate change and other factors are affecting the property insurance market and what can be done about it. We and our neighbors and friends may have received non-renewals or very large rate increases lately. This is very difficult for everyone. The purpose of this session is to learn more about the problem. So please don't make your questions about personal insurance circumstances. Put your questions in chat, and we look forward to a productive conversation on matters. Our two speakers are first Adam Cole. Adam's an insurance attorney who served for 8 years as general counsel with the California Department of Insurance. Our second speaker is Nancy Watkins. She is an actuary at Milliman, which is an international risk management firm where she specializes in climate related issues. She serves on the advisory board of the Wharton Risk Center Policy Incubator. She was one of the speakers at the Senate Budget Committee, and we look forward to hearing from both of them. So first, Adam, if you could, you're on, so go ahead and share your slides.
Yeah. You're muted.
Okay, can you hear me now? Thank
Yes.
you, sorry about that. First off, thank you very much for having me. I'm very impressed by the Marine Conservation League and all you're doing, the excellence of your advocacy and efforts to address the deepest problems on our Earth today. So for that, thank you, and I'm pleased to be part of a discussion with your group. What I will cover in my opening remarks are several things. First, my background very briefly. Next, what the California Department of Insurance does. Next, what is the crisis that we are currently facing with insurance availability and affordability for homes in California. Fourth, a brief depiction, if you will, of the dollar amount of insured catastrophe losses nationally by category, and we can put the wildfires in California into that context. Fifth, the causes of this current insurance availability crisis. Sixth, possible solutions to this crisis based on what I will call existing market players. And seventh, possible solutions to the availability of insurance crisis that would require the government to create a new market player. I should just note, I don't intend to advocate particular solutions because this is a complex area where, although I've both on behalf of clients and personally reflected a great deal, I don't have a specific silver bullet. I do, however, want to conclude the remarks with two areas I think should be areas of focus. My background in a nutshell, I was the general counsel of the California Department of Insurance from 2007 to 2015. I served two elected insurance commissioners, one a Republican, the other a Democrat, Steve Poizner, and then Dave Jones. My job as general counsel was to oversee a legal department of 100 lawyers. And in addition, I advised the commissioners of insurance on the most sensitive legal and public policy matters that face them. What then does the California Department of Insurance do? Most broadly speaking, it is a consumer protection agency and the largest in California. As far as our purposes are concerned, the Department of Insurance implements Proposition 103, which was a ballot initiative in 1988 that did a number of things, including creating an elected insurance commissioner. We had insurance commissioners prior to 1988, but they were appointed by the governor. The ballot initiative, the people in voting for the initiative concluded that this should be an elected official directly reportable to the people. And further, that Proposition 103 requires insurers to receive the department's prior approval before charging customers new rates. We are one of the only states in the union, if not the only one, with a strict prior approval regimen before insurance companies can raise or lower rates. What the department does in evaluating rate submissions is it applies mathematical formulas that are in regulations that the department issued to determine whether an insurer's requests yield either an excessive rate of return, which is prohibited, or an inadequate rate of return, which is also prohibited. What then is the insurance crisis we're currently facing and that we're here to discuss? The crisis is that in the face of heavy losses from wildfires, many insurers are contending that they cannot profitably operate in California. And insurers, not all, but many, including large homeowners insurers, are pulling out of or reducing their exposure in the market by either declining to renew coverage for homeowners in areas the insurers consider wildfire risk zones. So this is you have a policy that Nationwide or another insurance company has issued to you, and now you are notified that they will not renew it for you because you're in a wildfire risk zone or area. The other approach here is to decline to issue any new coverage in California, regardless of location. That, for example, is what State Farm has done. And the result of large insurers and a significant portion of the industry now withdrawing from California is that many homeowners can't get insurance, and this is a crisis. I place on the screen now a chart which we don't need to go into great detail. It depicts the dollar amount of catastrophes nationally by category, and I really have this up for one main purpose. First off, I hope you can all see it. It's clear and large enough on my screen to be able to make out the different parts. But if you look, what we have here are bars from 2013 to 2023, a chart, by the way, prepared by a risk analytics and brokerage firm known as Aon. I don't vouch for the accuracy of the figures, but they are a reputable entity. The chart shows by different category in each of these different years how much catastrophic loss the insurance industry in the United States faced. You will note, and for our purposes, the most important color, as my cursor I think is showing, is the orange. The orange represents wildfire. We have other types of catastrophe. The black represents tropical cyclone, which essentially means hurricane. So that's states like Florida, Louisiana, etc. The green, which is also a large unit of catastrophic loss in America, is severe convective storm. That would mean severe storms, tornadoes. Those can occur anywhere in the United States, but also, for example, in the heartland of the United States. But if we look here at the orange, which is wildfire, I'll just take one example. We have 3 years, 2017, 2018, and 2020 were very significant years for wildfire loss in California. And the legend down below with these numbers are in billions of dollars. So every half inch or so is $10 billion. So what we see here, say for 2018, is about $18 billion in wildfire loss nationally. The largest chunk of that is California, but some of it is other states such as Montana, Oregon, and so on. But California is certainly a large chunk. And in fact, the Camp Fire in November of 2018 was the largest wildfire in California history, with a total amount of loss of about $16 billion, of which $4 billion was uninsured and the remaining $12 billion was insured. That was the fire in which, for example, the town of Paradise was largely destroyed, a fire caused by downed PG&E transmission lines. So in short, though, these are very large dollars. No one is disputing that. Whether wildfire, the trend in wildfire is one that suggests continuing years like 2017 and 2018 remains to be seen. I want to mention, therefore, briefly, what are the causes of the crisis, by which I mean insurance companies declining to issue new coverage in California or to withdraw. We can think of cause in various conceptual levels. From my standpoint, the ultimate conceptual level is climate change. Wildfires, other natural disasters. There's no question we are seeing more of that. And of course, that imposes it creates damage which the insurance industry faces as its own liability. We move, however, around that to a series of additional causes, one of them being economic and market forces. Such economic forces as inflation and the price of reinsurance, which is the insurance that insurance companies like State Farm buy to cover the losses that they have insured. These numbers are going up. These are very expensive numbers, so that when a fire occurs, for example, it costs a lot more to replace it and repair it because of inflation. And furthermore, the trend in catastrophes means that reinsurance cost to the insurance companies is greater. We also have causes around the area of things like negligence of utilities, down transmission lines, that if they were properly maintained, the wildfire wouldn't actually have occurred or be as severe. We also have what I might call zoning laws or land use laws. These are big policy questions we all need to think about. Where are we building homes? Should we be building homes where we are building them? Do our general freedom of where our entire built structure is, does that need to be reconsidered? Then we have the whole area of regulation. The California Department of Insurance, for example, is it making life too difficult for insurance companies? Is it giving them the rates they need? Is it allowing the inputs into their rate submissions that they seek? Alternatively, according to some, is it not regulating enough? Maybe it needs to regulate more. Regulatory strategies of the insurance industry. What I mean by this is there is some possibility or speculation, I don't say I necessarily adhere to it, that withdrawal from California, threats to withdraw, are strategies by the insurance industry to achieve greater rate recovery from the Department of Insurance. And finally, I've put in forest management. That may not be the best phrase. Brush control. We have a set of issues about how we manage our environment that is subject to wildfires. So what are possible solutions to this crisis based on existing market players? Well, there are several possibilities. First off, mitigation, what I call mitigation. This means efforts and an entire public policy directed at increased improvement of homes and individual homes as well as communities to make them more resistant to fire, fire-resistant siding, ember blocking, vents, the technology that people on this call no doubt are very familiar with. Increased attention to that with a corresponding requirement that insurers provide coverage if homeowners or communities do those things. We don't have the latter part of that proposal at the moment, and that would require legislation, that requirement that insurers effectively honor the mitigation of communities and homeowners. Rate increases. This is another possible element of the solution. Insurance companies need more rate recovery. The Department of Insurance, is it giving them the rate they need? Do they need to afford rate increases anywhere between 20, 30, 40%, which the consuming public will have to bear? Furthermore, regulatory changes by CDI, the California Department of Insurance, two particular areas that have received attention both legislatively and otherwise, allow for use of prospective catastrophe modeling. I realize this is getting kind of technical sounding. The way the department's regulations currently stand, the department evaluates historical data and draws trend conclusions from those data, query whether a prospective catastrophe modeling approach, which might well involve artificial intelligence, would be an appropriate tool as the insurance industry is asking to help model their rate needs. I would add to this a possibility of considering requiring, if we do go down this road, of having what I would call a transparent public model and disallowing proprietary trade secret protected models. This would probably require legislation. The other regulatory change that is heavily discussed is allowing insurers to recover their reinsurance costs in rates. Again, this is getting a bit technical, but the current department regulations do not allow the insurance company to recover in the rates collected from consumers the price that the state farms and all states are paying unregulated, often out of state and often out of country reinsurance companies to insure those risks. I would add to this that it would seem to me that an appropriate reciprocal obligation would be is that if the Department of Insurance gave the industry one or both of these requests, that the industry should be required to insure all homeowners in California as a result of being given these additional rate increase options that they seek. That would require legislation. Changes in zoning laws, just to say, you know, again, maybe we need to rethink questions of where homes are allowed to be built and where they are. And finally, in terms of existing market players, the FAIR plan, which is essentially an insurer of last resort and a high risk pool for homeowners who can't get insurance on the open market. They can turn to this program, which is run by the insurance industry. It is essentially a placement facility of all of the homeowners insurers in California. They are required to participate, and they bear responsibility for this coverage proportionate to their share of the market. Could some adjustments to the FAIR plan resolve the problem and become the so-called insurer of last resort in light of wildfires? It is a question that is open for discussion. And finally, in terms of possible solutions, one's requiring the government to create a new market player. This is really sort of whiteboard public policy conversation that, as far as I can tell, I haven't seen the Department of Insurance or the legislature or the governor considering, and I think maybe this is where we end up having to go. Paradigm here would be that if we believe that the withdrawal of insurance companies from California and the reduction of availability is a market failure, a private market failure, then creating a new entity, Paradigm One, an entirely privately funded entity. Here we have, as an example, the California Earthquake Authority, which is an entirely privately funded, there's not a single dollar of tax money here. This is a program that was created after the Northridge earthquake in 1994, because prior to that time, that was an enormously costly earthquake with about $20 billion in then dollars damage, $10 billion of which was covered by insurance. The insurance industry in California, the private industry, decided, sort of as they are doing now with wildfire, to withdraw from selling earthquake insurance. This authority essentially uses premium dollars that customers pay. It is nonprofit. It also has the capacity to issue bonds to raise money. It reinsures. It now has about $18 billion in claim paying capacity. Would a model like this be a possibility for like a wildfire, California Wildfire Authority? It's a question. Paradigm two, in terms of a new market player, would be a taxpayer-funded entity. I wrote entirely, but I really should have written primarily. And we have many examples. One might be the National Flood Insurance Program. Again, prior to 1968, most of the homeowners insurers did provide flood insurance. And as floods became more severe, that private industry decided to withdraw from that coverage. A federal program was created. It was supposed to be self-sustaining based on premiums. The truth is, the vast bulk of dollars are coming from the U.S. taxpayer. The National Flood Insurance Program would a sort of version of it that is purely a state of California program be desirable or feasible? A question. Another federal example is the Federal Crop Insurance Corporation. We have believed as a society since at least 1938, during the Depression and the Dust Bowl, when that program was created, that our farmers deserve great attention and solicitousness. And so this program has been in place for 60, 50 something years. And it is, again, it was designed to be a program to provide coverage to farmers if drought and other adversities damage their crops. It was supposed to be self-sustaining. It has largely been federal taxpayer funded. I don't know whether it is viewed as a success, a failure, a misuse of the government. It's a possible template. And finally, this may seem odd, a Paradigm 3 would be a hybrid government entity to address the wildfire insurance crisis that is partly privately funded, partly taxpayer funded. And the example here, which may come as a bit of a surprise, just seeing it on the screen, the Federal Terrorism Risk Insurance Act. After 2011 and the terrorist attacks in New York, Washington, and Pennsylvania, the private insurance industry declined thenceforth to provide terrorism coverage in its insurance policies to businesses and homes and others. Congress concluded that this needed to be addressed. The next year, in 2002, Congress enacted a statute which basically said, and the insurance industry seemed comfortable with it, that you, the industry, will pay, we want you to continue to write this in terrorism coverage. We will, however, set a limit above which we, the federal government, will pay for the residue. So in other words, if there were a $1 million loss, maybe a private insurer would pay up to $400,000, and then the remainder of the tab of the damage would be footed by the federal government. Something like that is a possibility for wildfire in California. In other words, the private industry remains in business selling insurance, but there is what would be called an attachment point above which the state of California, or possibly a compact between a number of Western states, would pay the residue in damages. Finally, before I end, I mentioned two areas of focus. I based on client work I've done as well as public policy analysis, I personally do not believe that the insurance industry and the state of California have focused enough on mitigation measures and how effective they are, community level and home level, ember resistant ventings, all of the things one can do to make a home more impervious to fire. We at the Department of Insurance saw this firsthand when I and others toured fire zones in Southern California and elsewhere, and we would see communities where homes were destroyed except one home stood. It was literally an amazing visual, and that home had had significant mitigation. So it seems that the risk is notably lower. And finally, I do feel like we may be at a moment of market failure, private market failure, where turning to some model like the terrorism model might be appropriate. And I will end my comments there.
Thank you, Adam. Nancy?
Thanks, everybody, for having me today. Let's test my technological chops, see if I can share my screen. Can y'all see that all right?
Yes.
Great. Well, I appreciate Bob and Ken and Belle inviting me, and appreciate hearing Adam's remarks today. Just a little background about myself. I am an actuary. My job is to find out how much risk is, where it goes, and who ends up with it. I also live in Orinda, which is one of the high fire hazard areas of the town. I met a chief actuary from Mercury, and he told me our town was his worst nightmare, which apparently is not what the real estate agents are marketing it as. But the buildup of fuel and homes that could be burned in a conflagration is very severe here in Orinda. I do consult for a lot of homeowners, insurers, and industry trade groups. I also consult for the Town of Paradise, Western Fire Chiefs, National Association of Realtors, California Builders, Hawaii and Alabama, Connecticut insurance departments. So I work kind of in the middle. Also FEMA. And as a volunteer, most of the work that I'm going to be talking to you about today is volunteer work that I've been doing. I do a lot of testimony. I just spent last week in DC talking to Freddie Mac and the FHFA about these kinds of issues and what's going on. I also serve on the CAL FIRE Risk Modeling Advisory Work Group, and some of the things I'll be sharing today are going to be coming out in a report from them imminently. So I do have a fairly large amount of stuff, so I'm going to cover it at a high level and then follow up with questions, or just give you a copy of the slides. So I'm going to cover some of the same ground that Adam covered, maybe with a different twist, different framing, and maybe a more technical focus from my perspective as an actuary. So I think the first thing is to talk about what I'd say the three pillars of a sustainable private insurance market. Availability signifies that there's enough private insurers in a market. So that's predicated on them being able to manage, measure, and charge enough to take on the risk. Affordability signifies that the homeowners are willing and able to pay the premiums charged in order to transfer the risk. And reliability, which is what a lot of people don't really think about, signifies that the insurers in the market are confident and able to remain solvent, and they can pay their claims that are associated with the risk they've insured, given the environment in which they've operated. What do we have in California right now? I agree with Adam that we are at a moment of private market failure. We have climate change interacting with inherent risks that are causing cracks in all three of the pillars. With respect to availability, wildfire is extremely difficult to model and measure for many reasons. It's often human caused. It can spread far away from its point of origin. How fast it spreads depends a lot on local conditions that change quickly, like vegetation, how dry the vegetation is, wind, drought, And there's an interaction of risk between what we do and what our neighbors and community do. And most importantly, fires that burn down homes, are what we really are affected by in the insurance market, they don't just go away like a hurricane goes away or a tornado goes away. They get put out by people. So the activities and the presence and the intervention of fire suppression personnel make a huge difference in the outcome. That's quite hard to model. It's also increasing rapidly. I mean, Adam showed very nicely some of the recent years, the big dollar amounts that are attributable to fire, attributing a lot to climate change, but also by years of fire suppression that led to the buildup of vegetation with expanded development in the WUI. So there's also, as Adam noted, California regulatory restrictions on how to charge for the true cost of risk. The use of historical data to justify the total wildfire premium is not perceived by insurers as being an actuarially sound basis for the wildfire premium. And the cost of reinsurance is disallowed for wildfire, although it is allowed for earthquake. So conceptually, California has been allowing modeling and reinsurance for earthquake for many years, but they do not currently allow it for fire. So this has created a big gap in terms of what insurers think is the true cost of risk to the extent that they can measure it and what they're allowed to support in their rate filings. This is on an admitted basis. Non-admitted insurers don't have rate regulation. They're also not going to be subject to state guarantee fund protection. In terms of affordability, the lack of when the lack of availability reduces the number of competitors, that reduces the opportunities for price and coverage variation. So if you have an array of different price points, you can pick the lowest, and that just gives a better opportunity for affordability. We've also seen rate increases in recent years that have led to more homes that homeowners can't afford to insure. And then there's also coverage restrictions, especially for policies going to the FAIR plan. Reliability is a very big challenge in California. Companies need reinsurance protection to pay claims after catastrophic events. With the really nice slide that Adam put on, you could see how much the billion-dollar events have increased in the past few years. Reinsurers across the world are raising prices, limiting coverage, and exiting some markets to improve their returns. They're looking at 50% year-over-year increases, 40%, for several years in a row. And companies cannot not buy reinsurance. They would lose their credit ratings. They would threaten the solvency. Their ability to pay claims for existing policyholders are threatened. So they are squeezed by the need to buy more reinsurance, especially with inflation and the cost increases associated with those. The growth of the FAIR plan is a threat to private insurance market solvency in California. The FAIR plan's total insured value has increased by 5 times between 2017 and 2022. It was running at a deficit the last time they published their financials. And if the FAIR plan had a major event that wasn't covered by their surplus and reinsurance, the admitted insurance companies would be on the hook for everything in excess of what the FAIR plan could pay for. This goes straight out of their surplus. There is no provision for them to recoup that through future premium increases. It's possible that they could file for them, but there's no guarantee that they would get those increases or when they would get them, especially if they've had losses at the same time that the FAIR plan has had the losses. This is a major solvency issue for them. The third thing Adam touched on is the rate regulatory system in California is not perceived as stable. It's very unpredictable with respect to cost, timing, and outcome when companies submit a filing. So what I would say right now is I agree that we are in a crisis situation. I think that there's 4 different stressors that are each one individually able to take the private market down. I think any one could happen. We could have reinsurance cost increases and capacity decreases that make it impossible for companies to continue to write any more or any wildfire exposed policies. They might not even be able to have reinsurance to cover their FAIR Plan exposure. So that is a real issue. They might have no choice but to withdraw from part or all of California. If there are major wildfires in California or other places in the West, the impact on solvency and the perception of risk could trigger more company exits. I talked to you about the FAIR Plan risk spiral. The threat of assessment might be enough to drive companies out of the market. They are incentivized to leave before their competitors leave. It's like being the last guy at the bar. If you're all drinking together and somebody leaves, they throw down some money, they go away. The next person throws down some money, they go away. Whoever sits there the longest is going to be stuck with the bill. And maybe they'll have enough money to pay the bill and maybe they won't. But the risk goes up the longer you sit there. I worry that companies are going to look at each other and think, I really don't want to be the company that gets stuck paying if the FAIR Plan has a bad outcome. If there is pressure to do something, either regulatory or legislative, and whatever is done is perceived as being adverse to the industry and not responsive to their concerns, I think that would be enough to trigger a market withdrawal as well. So that sounds very hopeless. What I'd say is there is hope. I also agree with Adam that we haven't focused enough on mitigation. The only solution, in my opinion, to the problem is driving down the risk. And that means not home level focus, but community level focus. I started working on this a year and a half ago with the Western Fire Chiefs Association. We put together a group of volunteers in Stanford last year. We had CAL FIRE there. We had actuaries from different companies, CAP modelers, a representative from CDI. And the question for them is that we asked is, what is standing in the way of you measuring community wildfire risk and the effect of mitigation? Like, what in terms of data, science, understanding, what is keeping you from being able to reflect community mitigation risk in catastrophe models? Because we know the CAP models are the key to what insurers are using and what reinsurers are using to measure their risk. I've got a whole appendix on CAP models. I'm not going to go into them today, but I will assure you that actuaries consider them to be the best available science. They certainly are not perfect. But we don't have any better way right now to understand wildfire risk. And certainly we don't have any better way to understand how do you reduce the risk through mitigation. So this is what we were focusing on. One reinsurer that I interviewed, I've done a lot of interviews in the past year, has helped crystallize thinking about this. I'm not going to read all this, but his point is that if we want real change from the insurance and reinsurance industry, then mitigation needs to be visible. It doesn't have to just be done. It has to be effective and reduce structure to structure fire spread. And it has to be made visible on an ongoing basis, on a current basis, to insurers and reinsurers. Otherwise, they cannot take it into account. It's not a matter of will not, it's cannot. They are very concerned about not understanding the risk. If they can't see a mitigation, if they can't quantify it, they can't do anything with it. Anecdotal evidence is not sufficient, especially if it's just this place here and that place there, and they don't have information about the whole state or even the whole West. So we created 5 work streams last year, focusing on specific things that we were told were gaps in the data and the science around and the transparency around mitigation. First is understanding what happens when a fire gets into a community. It's pretty well understood how fire spreads through vegetation. It is not at all well understood how fire spreads from a structure to structure. So there is work done right now by University of Colorado to better model how fire really spreads. And the second is to start getting very common definitions aligned around what are the mitigations that matter. So communication to consumers and firewise communities and fire chiefs, all of it is consistent. Now, they might not agree on how much it changes the risk, but at least we can agree on what words to use. When we say zone 0, what does that mean? When we say zone 1, what does that mean? When we say, well, I'm not going to get into it technically, but just what are the things that we should be measuring? That is the first step to measuring. The third thing is to measure how to beef up our fire departments and how to understand what capabilities they have to come in and deal with a wildfire. This is not just a matter of understanding local fire suppression forces. It's also understanding the network of agreements that they have with each other to respond in case of a major emergency. And to understand how far apart these the entities are that they have agreements with, because time matters when it happens, when we're talking about fire modeling. Also, mitigation has a lot of social roadblocks. We realize this, and we need to communicate mitigation needs differently for different types of communities. And finally, the very big idea, the backbone to all of this, is an open source data commons. I've been pitching this since I think about 18 months ago. It's gaining a lot of traction. Essentially, the idea is parcel level mitigation inspections that would be available to the individual homeowners and that could be aggregated up within the community, but essentially giving the ability to go beyond, this is what Nancy did, this is what Nancy's neighbor did, this is what the down the street neighbor did, and be able to aggregate that up. This is the level of mitigation in Nancy's neighborhood. This is the level of mitigation in the town of Orinda, and really be able to start generalizing and understanding where the hot spots are in your own town and where we need to focus our mitigation efforts. This, I believe, it should be fed by the insurance industry, the CAL FIRE inspectors, FireWise people who could be trained to do inspections. If we have good phone apps, we could have people do their own home inspections as long as they're documentable. This should allow a lot better awareness of what mitigation has been done and what needs to be done. And that will, I think, bring much transparency, much needed transparency to this dialogue. Just a little bit of background in terms of fire spread in the built environment. There's 3 different pathways that need to be disrupted. This is a graph that I get from Cal Poly WUI Fire Institute. One of the ex-fire chiefs I work closely with has put this together. There's 3 different fire pathways we need to follow: vegetation to vegetation outside of the community, vegetation to structure as fire transitions into a community, and then structure to structure within the community. You just don't have the same kind of disruption and mitigation. You have to think about the different fire pathways when you think about mitigation and measuring mitigation. Let's see, I've lost my ability to advance. There we go. So this is our disruption, how they differ depending on where you are on the pathway. We are working on a pilot with Rancho Mission Viejo, which is a master planned community in SoCal. We're going to try to put together a lot of the different ideas that we're piloting. First, modeling where the fires are most likely to come in. I mean, coming into Orinda, the fires on a high wind, high heat, low humidity day will always come from the east. If they're coming from, down one side of the town, or I guess there's a piece of the town that the fire could come down from the Berkeley Hills, from the west, but they're never going to come from the north or the south. So we already know this. We know exactly which parts of the community are most at risk. When we can model these fire pathways, we can incorporate them into dynamic community wildfire protection plans, not have a little notebook that sits on a shelf, but something that gets updated as parcels get mitigated and new inspections are done. The partial mitigation inspections and part of this data commons that I'm talking about would feed the CWPPs. We would be able to model structure to structure spread and know better where we could effectively mitigate and where we could bring our resources to convince people that, like, the houses on the outskirts of the town are the most important to protect the rest of the town. So how do we make that happen? Giving better structure metrics to the insurance community, to the fire professionals managing the fire risk in the community, to the FireWise people that are on the ground trying to spread the word, trying to explain to neighbors why they have to do the things they don't want to do. If we start having common language and better metrics around this, I think it will be a lot more convincing. WUI fire protection scores, that has to do with evaluating the capabilities of the fire suppression personnel. And then we're going to build in interviews with CAP modelers, insurers, and reinsurers to get their input and feedback and say, if you saw this for a community, if you saw this for all the communities in California in the WUI, would this help you understand wildfire risk? Would it help you understand and acknowledge the benefits of mitigation? That is the first step, I think, to bending down the risk curve and to changing insurer and reinsurer behavior. So just to finish, what we're talking about is a lot of effort around measurement. All these things that I've just talked to you about, we want to align the way that these are measured and how the information gets into risk models, and feed the measurement into fire science and research, to communicate all of this kind of need for mitigation and how to mitigate, not only through insurance discounts, but also through fire protection, building codes, land use policies, HOAs around mitigation maintenance. Certainly to actively mitigate, to prioritize the things that are going to give us the most bang for the buck, to improve our comprehensive protection capabilities. And then when we have mitigated, feed it back into the models, make sure that the new measurements come through. The fires will keep coming. It doesn't matter what PG&E does. There is so much risk out there that the ignitions will happen from somewhere. If we don't want Lahaina's and Paradises to happen over and over and over again, this is, I think, what we need to do. To me, focusing on changing the insurance mechanism is not sufficient at all to fix the problem. So on a policy basis, these are the things I would recommend as kind of general principles: being flexible, understanding the risk and communicating it, modeling it better, prioritizing mitigation more than we do now, and putting resources towards effective mitigation, not just effort, but efficacious. Bringing resources, especially to vulnerable communities that might not have the resources to afford what they need to do, and then aligning across different stakeholder groups to ensure the message. So hope that is helpful to you. I do have a whole appendix on CAP models, but we don't have to talk about that now. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much, both of you. This has brought up some areas of common understanding and belief, and differences on how to evaluate the issues, and also differences on policy going forward. Those of you who have questions, would you please put them in the chat? That would be great, or we'll honor your hands being up if necessary. I wanted to start out with a question for both of you, and that is, could you elaborate on how insurance companies can consider mitigation in their rating plans? An example is Commissioner Lara's regulation, Safer from Wildfire Framework, that's what it's called, requiring insurance companies to submit new rate filings incorporating wildfire safety standards created by the department and establishing a process for releasing wildfire risk determinations to residents and businesses within 180 days. And this regulation is likely, possibly, at least they claim, to result in transparency by providing consumers with their property wildfire risk score and a right to appeal that. So what do you think of it? What do you know of it? And we'd be interested in that. So I'll start out with that question to both Adam and to Nancy.
Well, why don't I start as a former regulator? That regulation, which the department issued in 2022, last year, is a start. I think it's a fair start to say to insurance companies, if you choose to rate homes for insurance purposes based on their wildfire risk, if you do that, then you must do the following. You must provide a clear explanation to your policyholders as to why you've determined that their wildfire risk is at a certain level. There is indeed a right of appeal, but no standards provided by which the policyholder can contest that characterization. And furthermore, that if you, as a homeowner, do in fact mitigate your home, and the community also has done things of that sort, that you will be required, insurance company, to provide a discount. Here, though, is the problem with that regulation, and that is it doesn't address the concept that we refer to in the trade as underwriting. In other words, it doesn't say to insurance companies, you must insure Californians who mitigate. That remains a choice for the insurance company. So, for example, even with that regulation in place, State Farm is permitted to cease to write new coverage in California. Other insurance companies are permitted to decline to renew a policy or to issue one in the first place where the company feels the wildfire risk is great. In short, it really doesn't address the problem.
Nancy?
So I would say that the commissioners, the Safer from Wildfires framework is based mostly on the IBHS Wildfire Prepared Home Standard. So the components are similar, very, very close, and that's a good thing because the industry actually believes in the Wildfire Prepared Home Standard. The problem is IBHS emphasizes that you have to do all the things or that they won't work. And the CDI requirement is to give credits for each individual activity. So let me give you an analogy. If you were an engineer and you were asked to design a bridge that wouldn't fall down, and you designed it with a certain kind of steel strength and a certain kind of attachments and certain, you know, kinds of engineering, like all and piers built in. And then somebody said, okay, well, what if you made the steel less strong, or took out some of the piers, or you made everything just a little bit thinner? Can you tell me the probability that it would fall down? And can you do like each one of those individually? If you only do like make the steel a little bit stronger, would it still fall down? Would it, if you made it like change the composition of the steel, would it still fall down? And then you have to pay for the whole thing if it falls down. So this is what the insurance companies are being faced with, is having to model things that are not really modelable. Nobody actually knows that any of these things one-off, like in and of themselves, will reduce wildfire risk in any measurable way. They do know, or they do believe, that doing all of them will reduce wildfire risk to the extent that any individual home can make a difference when you are ignoring what's going on around the home. So you basically got an actuarial request that flies in the face of the science, and that is a problem. Another problem is there is no provision in there that allows the undiscounted premium to be adequate. from the insurance company's perspective. So they're asking for a discount off of an amount that the insurance companies don't think is adequate to start with. Now, whether each individual company's rates are adequate or not is a different question, but there's no provision in the reg. You're just starting with discounts. So there's also no provision that helps you get this data. And I want to tell you, it costs money to send a person out and inspect a house. And if every time somebody asks for a new version of their discount, you have to go and do a home inspection, that's a problem. I think all of this business about scores and disputes is just going to add to confusion. I do not think it's going to help availability. I think it's likely to frustrate people very badly because they'll expect something to happen that was good and it didn't happen.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, I don't think it's going to help the system. And I'm sorry, I actually have a hard stop at 11. I'm supposed to be in a meeting. I'll stay on for another minute or so, but that's yeah.
Thank you, Nancy. I'm mindful that there is one question that's in the chat from Matt Sampson, who's one of the directors of the Marin Municipal Water District. And I wondered if you might take a quick look at that and address that issue, because it relates to what you're talking about as far as mitigation.
So the mosaic and the alignment of project for regional benefit.
Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely think that we this is the RMV pilot that I'm talking, Rancho Mission Viejo pilot that I'm talking about. We really want there to be, ultimately, we want there to be a way of saying, okay, CAL FIRE maps say this is a high hazard community, but through this combination of actions, we have reduced our hazard level for our risk level for the community down from red to lavender or, yellow or something. Like we've got to have words for it. They're not there yet, but we want to have specific combinations of actions that will be objective and easily described to individual communities that take your individual circumstances into account. And I think they will involve the CWPP. I think they will involve new metrics like the probability of more than 10% of the homes burning down in a given year, or I'm sort of spitballing here, but we're going to need some metrics that we can use as benchmarks for when you have dropped the risk. And we're going to need the science of the fire pathways modeling that I'm talking about and what you've done to disrupt those fire pathways to be reflected in the catastrophe modeling. So where we are starting is by talking to CAL FIRE, who's been very heavily involved in all this. There will be a report coming out pretty soon from this risk modeling advisory work group that I'm on that talks about the need for alignment. The word alignment is a very big word. And so I'm sorry, Matt, it's not exactly a great answer to your question, but CAL FIRE is on it. This group that I'm working with is on it. And the insurance industry wants this. They want hope and a plan. I think if we rally around this kind of plan and they think, okay, this actually will make a difference, I think that will keep them in the market long enough for us all not to have like a real estate collapse.
Right. No, Nancy, and thank you for that. That's appreciate the response on that, and especially all the work you're doing in the space. We're just, as a 22,000 acre landholder in the middle of Marin County, surrounded by incredibly valuable real estate, we want to make sure we're not the ones that the fingers are pointed at when the cat risk models come back and say your watershed is going to be contributing to a catastrophic fire in these neighborhoods. So we want to make sure to use the limited funds we have in the right place so that the insurance agencies already believe or have shown us that this is a reduction in risk, because we feel that that's where the science is pointing to in terms of where it's going to be coming from recommendations.
Great. Well, it's exactly these kinds of thoughtful choices that I think are going to make a difference. What we're lacking right now is a really high level plan for you to plug into. But this is the kind of thing that CAL FIRE has been working on. And I think their report might make you happy that it's going to look like the start of a plan, which is not the greatest thing in the world. You'd probably rather me just tell you a website with a plan on it, but that's not there yet.
Well, thank you for your efforts. I appreciate it.
Thank you. I'm going to say goodbye. Really good to see y'all. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Nancy.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Nancy. Yeah,
Adam, a question we had was, there was some testimony that Douglas Heller gave to the Senate Banking Committee last week, in which he suggested as one of a couple of ideas as to how we could start reshaping the insurance dynamic, something where insurers would be required to conduct rigorous climate risk analysis. We've heard something about that today, but he also suggested that insurers should be required to give a timeline to stop insuring and investing in the oil and gas firms fueling climate change. Under existing California Department of Insurance regulations, is something like that feasible in California?
It's, how to put this? It's kind of a game of who's going to flinch first, in the sense that the department's regulatory authority, for example, to force insurance companies to disinvest from fossil fuel securities. Keep in mind, insurance companies are major investors. That's how they build up their capital and maintain their surplus. So the investment portfolio of insurance companies is their lifeblood activity, actually. Strictly speaking, there's no law in California forcing them to divest from securities that the department feels are bad to hold. So I think the answer, on the other hand, it presents something of a public policy disaster for the insurance industry to challenge it in court. And so that's why I say it's kind of who's going to flinch first. The industry has been willing over the last few years to accede to departmental requests to produce information about all of its securities that it holds that are related to fossil fuel investment. An actual order that they divest, as Doug Heller was urging, would probably require legislation in California. That legislation seems to me that it would pass. I think the whole question of creating new laws in California to address all of the issues we've talked about faces the political hurdle of will new law even remotely stand a chance?
thank you. We have a question. Bill Carney, you have a question. You want to repeat your question in person?
Sure. The question is, can the reduction of the greenhouse gas emissions that are at the core of the insurance crisis be factored into your calculations and solutions, especially regarding insurance rates? So I'm seeing, there's a lot of money flowing here, including from the check I just wrote for my insurance. There's a lot of money flowing here, and can any piece of that go to actually solving the root problem of greenhouse gas? You just touched on one possible solution, but I'd be really interested in hearing that.
Well, I mean, you could, I'm just thinking out loud here for the first time. I mean, you could, there could be a surcharge on policy premiums. This makes your premium go up, but, it would be like $1 per consumer, which would go toward a fund of some sort that would be dedicated to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Within the existing legal structure, the laws, I don't think you could, for example, reduce the rates that you give to an insurance company based on its own greenhouse gas emission profile, whether it's big buildings in Illinois or California or its investments. That too, I mean, that would be an interesting angle to have a legal change that would reduce rate recovery for an insurance company if it had a greenhouse gas negative practices. In existing regulations, there is a so-called efficiency standard, which affects the rate that a given insurance company gets, which is something like this, that all insurance companies are in a sense compared with each other. And if State Farm is producing its insurance, generating insurance at a greater cost than, say, Allstate, if Allstate is more efficient in its marketing and its advertising, that State Farm will effectively be surcharged for not being as efficient as an insurer. Could some kind of an efficiency rationale be fitted into existing regulations versus a new law? One thing, so those are just a few initial thoughts. In general, when I think about it, it's what makes this such a difficult public policy question is I think we all agree that greenhouse gas emissions are the big problem. But when you trace it down to an individual insurance company is applying to the Department of Insurance for a 6.9% rate increase with data that it has submitted, and your mind is on greenhouse gas emissions, there's no easy translation of that large scale issue to the immediate question of, has this insurance company justified actuarially and mathematically its rate request?
Yeah, it requires new ways of thinking, which is what I'm trying to insert here into these calculations.
I mean, I would just add to that, Bill, that this is not meant as a critique of my former employer, the Department of Insurance. New ways of thinking is not exactly the stuff of a state regulator. I mean, the state regulator's mentality is one that is very conservative, that does not feel that sort of blue sky thinking is necessarily going to protect consumers. We're all about protecting the consumers. The approach of the department in the past has protected consumers. It has saved consumers billions upon billions of dollars in premiums that they would otherwise have been paying if Proposition 103 hadn't come into being. The regulator needs a great deal of hand-holding to believe that certain radical ways of rethinking are appropriate.
Yeah. And there's another root cause of the climate crisis, right? We're trapped inside our boxes, right? And yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think that we may be ready.
I have one more question for Adam. I just wanted to ask if we could.
Yeah, go ahead.
So Adam, you talked about earlier about the terrorism insurance sort of federal reinsurance program. Doug Heller of the Consumer Federation of America talked about that as sort of a nationwide umbrella policy or reinsurance program covering the property insurance market. And I think one thing that was interesting about those charts you put up earlier was the fact that the black bar, which is hail damage and thunderstorm damage and tornadoes in the Midwest, is as big as the wildfire thing. But do you have any thoughts about some sort of a national reinsurance market or federal reinsurance market over the top?
No. The short answer is no. My focus has primarily been on California and what it can do. And I also have felt when you look at existing models today, possible paradigms for California or the nation, they tend to be segmented into different types and categories of loss, from terrorism to hurricane to wildfire. So if you have in mind some kind of a federal reinsurance really just means taxpayer support for, ultimately, federal or state taxpayer support for a market that isn't working. Whether it makes sense to have some overarching umbrella that covers all types of risk as opposed to just wildfire. I don't know whether that was part of the question, but in essence, yes, I think what I was saying in the end of my remarks is I think that some state or federal, taxpayer committed funding to assure that everyone in California can buy a homeowner's policy at a reasonable price may well be where we're headed, with, I would add to this, additional state funding to assure that people of low income can afford the mitigation measures, which individual homeowners is not cheap. That is where we are. I think I would probably just leave this conversation by saying, I don't think there's a fix. I think that the notion there's a fix here purely based on the private market. We should not necessarily think that, and that we therefore have to realize that this is a public policy problem beyond just the insurance industry, perhaps beyond just PG&E's transmission lines, that if we really need to grapple with the severity of climate change, it's going to require significant public support, which has not yet appeared anywhere in the radar of the gubernatorial, legislative, or Department of Insurance proposals.
Thanks. There are more questions. Let's see the timing. Should we have just 2 more questions or 1 more question? Suzanne, you had a question. I just saw it. Why don't you repeat it?
Oh, I was just gonna ask if, we are fortunate enough to have the Marin Wildfire Power Authority give us grants. Like, I just replaced all my vents with Vulcan vents, fireproof vents. But is there any thought to the insurance companies providing grants for people to do fire mitigation? Because that would seem to be in everybody's interest, but I don't know if that's something that's possible.
Yes, that has been suggested, and I can't remember where that stands, but in terms of the exact law that would be permitting the insurance company, I think it would be consistent with California insurance law as it currently stands for an insurance company to dedicate a portion of its premium to a program of funding presumably lower income homeowners to mitigate their homes, because after all, that process will ultimately save the insurance company money if the home is more resistant. The only reason I hesitate in giving a definitive answer is that when the department approves a rate increase, the purpose of the rate increase and the purpose of the rate is to assure both that the rate is not excessive, but also not inadequate. We need to be sure, the Department of Insurance needs to be sure that the money that's coming into the insurance company is available to pay claims. So there's a limit on how much sort of charitable activity can be used. But I think there probably is a there in what you just said.
Yeah.
And Bill, if you don't mind, if I can add to that, I do know that there's at least one insurance company that does want to continue to insure in California and does see this as a way to protect their investments. I haven't seen it materialize yet, but there have been discussions.
And this may be a good time for me to introduce Mark Brown, who just spoke up.
I think I'm going to sign off. Thank you all for having me. A good conversation, and appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Adam.
Thank you, Adam.
Yeah. I need to say that just for those of you who don't know it, that I'll disclose that Adam is my son. So I was very pleased to have him here, and I liked his remarks. Okay, Mark. Mark is the executive officer of the Marin Wildfire Prevention Authority, and he was a founding member of the North Bay, I love this, incident management team a type 3 all hazards IMT in the San Francisco Bay Area and was the program manager and one of the incident commissioners. And his deployments include floods, earthquakes, public health emergencies, hurricanes, oil spills, mudslides, civil unrest, wildfires, and planned events. And I've been working with Mark as chair of the Ecologically Sound Practices Partnership for 2 or 3 years now. And no better colleague is there. We work so well together, and he has taken the insurance issue in hand, and I think it was Dennis Rodini who wrote an article in the IJ on this very subject, which we can make available if you don't have it. Anyway, let me introduce Mark to make a few comments about what he's heard and also what you're doing, mainly about what you're doing. Mark.
Thank you, Bill. And I got to tell you, we love our partnership with the Ecologically Sound Practices. It's proven to be very successful. One thing I wanted to remind folks that they may not be aware of, this week is the 100-year anniversary of Marin's largest wildfire, and that burned from Novato to Bolinas. And just let's compare now and then. There were 35 homes in Woodacre in 1923. 30 of them were destroyed.
Ooh.
There are a heck of a lot more than 35 homes in Woodacre right now. So think about that level of loss. And that same night, in September 17th, 1923, the Berkeley Hills fire burned. That same night, the Hanley fire actually burned, or the Nuns fire, or not that Nuns, the Tubbs fire, whatever you want to call it. That same night, that fire burned. The Nuns fire burned that same night. So history does repeat itself in the wildfire world, but let's put some perspective on it. The Hanley fire in 1964 took 2.5 days to fill its perimeter. In 2017, the Tubbs fire did it in 6 hours. 2.5 days versus 6 hours. So that's the wildfire environment that we have today. So what is the MWPA doing to help residents maintain their insurance? And I do think that is one of the #1 concerns our residents have right now is protecting their homeowners insurance. We do have a $21 million a year budget that's going towards risk mitigation at the regional level. We're doing everything we can to help bring in alignment that all the agencies, land management, fire, public safety, law enforcement, what have you, is pulling the string and they're pulling the rope in the same direction. One thing that Nancy didn't discuss, but I know that she was involved in this modeling. If you take the International or Institute for Insurance and Business and Home Safety, IBHS, you take their prepared home standards. If you apply that to a good vast majority of your neighborhoods, of your communities, and you create community buffers, you create a significant decrease in an insurance annual average losses. And that's really what resonates with the insurance companies, decrease their annual average losses. So that is really what we're trying to do. We're trying to get people to adhere to the IBHS standards, and then we are doing the community buffers, so on and so forth. We're averaging 33,000 inspections a year out of 80,000 inspectable properties in Marin. We're averaging 33,000 inspections a year. And what that is doing is helping our residents learn what they should be doing, how they can do it. But it's also creating a massive database, exactly what Nancy was talking about. And we're doing risk modeling based on that database so that we can identify our riskiest areas so we can take action there. But we're also showing the community, or we'll be able to show, we haven't gotten there yet, but we're going to have a dashboard that the community will be able to see the level of risk reduction they have created within their communities. We're also disrupting those pathways that Nancy had talked about, whether it's through our defensible space work along the WUI boundary, our shaded fuel breaks, but we're also working on what's called strategically placed large area treatments that are placed in the pathways where fires want to burn. A big part of it also is our public education and getting the public on board so they can learn what they need to know. And here's the problem. We're only doing it in Marin. Or I wouldn't say we're only doing it in Marin. We're doing it in Marin. There's other communities that are doing this. As big as our effort is in Marin, probably not large enough to motivate insurance companies to insure in Marin. They need to spread their risk across a very large area such as the entire state. So while there's a lot of communities that are making similar efforts to ours, it's not enough in California. We need to get more communities doing exactly what we are doing. And then the MWPA is really trying to be a part of the solution for the insurance issue rather than have a solution slammed down our throats, for lack of a better word. So we are reaching out with to legislators. We are reaching out to the CDI. We're entering in partnerships with Milliman, CoreLogic, and some of the reinsurance companies to discuss exactly the options that Adam talked about and also the solutions that Nancy was presenting. So I was actually quite encouraged listening to both presentations today because it's very much in alignment with the work that we have been doing. And so I look forward to meeting with Nancy in the future and continuing brainstorming and coming up with a solution. But it's going to take years, and it's not going to be one solution. It's going to be multiple solutions that need to come together, and it's going to take time.
Yes, that seems to be what everybody who studies this issue ends up with a suggested solution, recognizing how tough it's going to be. And one of the key political issues, of course, is the difficulty of raising rates, if that is required. And so I think we can close up this part of the discussion today, unless somebody has further comments to make that weren't brought up and you think we could chat with it. You want to chat about it now? I mean, Bernie, you made a point I thought was interesting about reaching out to the real estate industry. You're muted.
I figured their input would be of some use. And I was also seeing if they were aware of that issue. And someone else, I responded to someone's question. I wanted them to come. I wanted to see if they would have input or they were considering the issue when they were selling the houses they were trying to sell. I mean, in this day and age, if I was buying a house, that's something that, my risk factors would be something I'd want to know. Just the way I'd want to know about the houses, the home's efficiency now, or greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, it's the modern age. This is our issues.
Yeah.
But
Bill, if
none of them showed up.
I could share some thoughts along. Bill, if you don't mind, I could share a couple of thoughts on that. Number one, the MWPA has had the opportunity to meet with many of the realtors in Marin to discuss the wildfire problem. A lot of our discussion was actually their practices for the street value or making the home look good, and they'll sometimes just throw gorilla hair down all over the property to make it look good, and that's exactly what we don't want them to do. So we've had that opportunity with them. But there's also Assembly Bill 38 that requires resale inspection for homes that are in very high fire threat areas. So the insurance agents really are familiar with that. They know that homes that are in the WUI or high fire threat homes are going to have to require an inspection that will let the buyer know about the home hardening and defensible space efforts they need to go through. It won't necessarily tell them about the insurability of the home, but at least they know that what risk factors there are at that home and what they need to do to mitigate them.
Yeah. Is that a bill that's passed, or is that a bill that's
It's a bill that's passed. It's been in effect for about 2 years now.
Okay, fine, thanks. Okay, Susanna?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, the grants are not widely known. And if I hadn't happened to have a colleague on the Climate Commission say, oh yeah, there's grants from the Marin Wildfire, I wouldn't have known about them. And it's not the Wildfire Authority's part, but I think that's something that needs to go out more wildly, because it certainly prompted me to do a lot of fire prevention work. And I'd also like more information about how to get my whole neighborhood to do it.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Are you working on that? No.
I'm not, because I don't know quite how to get started, but I do want to do it. I've, really become aware of this issue now that I, haven't been before. And I think it relates to my climate work because the carbon released by wildfires is horrifying.
That's absolutely right. It is, yeah. So I'm going to mention something as we move along about a way to address the question of reaching out. So any other comments that people want to make at this point? Okay, great. So Bob, why don't we hand it over to you for the finishing up of the event, and it's 11:30.
Great. Well, the speakers are gone, so I can't thank them, but I thought that the presentations were great. And there's clearly some really excellent thinking that's going on right now, which is exactly what's needed. And I also want to thank Mark Brown, Mark, for the work that you're doing. There's excellent work going on there as well.